Welcome to the story. We're going to read a story. First, we're going to read the Bible, and then we're going to we're going to reading Hittite Warrior. I hope you guys do make a like and subscribe on this video. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed. Yeah. Another day. My throat's back. Hope you guys enjoy. Here's my dad for the Bible.
The neighbors have their music on.
Hello, how are you doing today? We are on Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We're almost through Ecclesiastes. We have just 4 more chapters to go. So, let me go ahead and get started. Does everybody have their Bible? Just waiting for everybody in the room to have their Bible. I think we weren't quite ready, so I apologize for that. Okay, so...
Chapter 8 or 9?
Chapter 9. All right. This is from the English Standard Version, chapter 9. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. All the good one is, so is the sinner. Or as the good one is, so is the sinner. And he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Also the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and the madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that they go to the dead. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. And they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. Go eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white, let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time. Like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time, when it suddenly falls upon them. I have also seen the example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed greater to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise, heard in quiet, are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. That is the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10, 11, and 12 are all pretty short, so we will be finishing those in the next 3 reading sessions. And may God richly bless you with the reading of his word. Let us continue. So in the last section, I believe what happened And you have to forgive me, it's been a few days and we've been traveling. So, it's like our mascot. But we aren't actually reading any books about the baby about Baby Yoda. So, you know. All right. So in the last section, we had Sisera tested Uriah, and Uriah told him that the Hebrews aren't thinking about any kind of plot against Sisera, and that nothing bad was going to happen. And then Sisera reunited Uriah with his old horse Labarnish, and Labarnish ran with Uriah tied behind him until he died. And that is not what happened, but Kimberly's about to tell you what did happen.
He told them about Uriah told him about the plot that the Hebrews had, and how they were gonna go and attack the city. So Sisera, I think.
Yep.
He's like, okay, yeah, I already knew that. I wish there was something that I didn't know. So, and then he showed him Labarnish, and Uriah's like, oh, that's my old horse! I trained it since it was a foal! And he's like, oh, well, I found it over here, and it was, like, abandoned or something. And so, he starts training for war. He's gonna be a charioteer. And just as they're about, long story short, there's an Egyptian with him, and just as they're about to start the battle, one of his teammates is sent to a different chariot, and somebody else has replaced him. And I think we know this person. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read us a story.
And not only that, but everybody loved the Egyptian. He was like everybody's favorite dude. They all wanted to be like him. It was sort of like Michael Jordan, you know, the old commercials, like Mike, want to be like Mike, want to be like Mike. Kids have never seen that. All right, so I'm going to continue with chapter 19. And by the way, no, nobody liked the Egyptian, but Uriah kind of did, actually. So anyway, all right, so this is chapter 19, Wax and Mutton Fat. For thousands of years, all the nations of the world had met in battle on the plain of Australon.
Australia?
Australon?
It's Estralon.
Ooh, I like it.
Estralon, the plain of Estralon. Men of the east met from Sumeria and later Babylon. Men from the desert had battled there with the ancient inhabitants of Canaan, later settling down to mingle and become one people. Egyptians had come there and conquered the kings of Canaan on that plain. Joshua, the hero of all the Hebrew stories, had fought there many years ago. Excuse me. Hittites had come down and conquered there, driving all before them, Egyptians and Canaanites alike. Now it was my turn. We circled and entered from the south. We rode on to the level ground divided by the great highway, with its fertile fields in wheat and barley, its many flowers. All around us were the great hills. Always ahead of us in the distance was the mountain of Tabor, with its wooded slopes rising from the plains like a great lowering mound. Often as we rode, I stole a glance at Hannibal, but he never looked at or spoke to me. In that first moment I had rejoiced to see him again. Then I had seen the change that had come over him. He had looked at me only once, then turned his head and kept silent. By nightfall we had reached our destination. We pitched our camp on the ground not too far from Tabor. The rain still came down, but troops were put to work at once to dig trenches and barricades to guard the encampment from any surprise attack. Moses, Haruwandulis, Hannibal, and I huddled in our tent, warmed by coals of fire in a little pot. Sometimes we looked out across the valley toward the heights of Tabor and thought we could make out dark figures among the flares that lit the lower slopes. "Can you hear them sing?" asked Moses. And over the wet night air came the faint sounds of the shouts and chanting by many voices. "They are dancing before their God," I said. "We could show them some dancing of our own," said Harowandulus, and broke into a battle song, but I did not join him. "I could sing them a song," said Moses, and I thought he would croon one of the sentimental songs of the Egyptian soldier, 7 days to yesterday, or "If you would come to me speedily," but instead he bowed his head as if in prayer and sang softly, "How manifold are thy works! They are hidden from before us, O sole God, like whom there is no other." "Shut your mouth!" shouted Hannibal, speaking for the first time. The three of us stopped still and stared at him. His face had gone white with fear and anger. "Do you want to make sure that we all die with your wicked jokes? The song of the accursed Pharaoh on a night like this? May the Baals forgive us all!" And with a little sob he pressed to his lips the amulet that hung about his neck. I looked at Harowandulus and saw that he had turned pale. The rain had lighted into a mist in the early morning, and a word was spread that the champion was going out to challenge the Hebrews. This custom was strange to the Canaanites, though it was often done among the Hittites and the sea people. A champion fighting man would ride out in the light chariot and offer single combat to any champion of the enemy who would take up his challenge. Such a combat often decided the outcome of a battle. We gathered with the others to watch, and I was not surprised to see that it was a Philistine who had ridden out. Several of the Philistine envoys to the island towns had come with the hosts more out of curiosity than for any other reason. This man was splendid in his many-plumed helmet, decorated with the teeth of wild boars, with his white teeth and sea-gray eyes. He rode straight out across the plain, and I wondered why Sisera had sent him. Why should he take the risk of a single combat when our chariots were strong enough to wipe out the enemy entirely? "The rain is coming down again," muttered Hannibal. For a long time the Philistine rode back and forth before the lower slopes of Tabor, shouting his insults and his challenge. Then he rode back. We were close enough to see the anger in his eyes and the dark frown on the face of Sisera. "They are cowards," cried Harowandulus. "Barak, they are great fighting men. Too much of a coward to take up a challenge, even when it was his only chance. Well," he turned to the rest of us, "why didn't they send out their witch, Deborah?" There was a sound of laughter, but Moses, when we were back in our tent, looked at me with serious eyes. "They say you know Barak," he said. "Why do you think he would let such a chance go by?" "He is very clever," I said slowly. "What is clever about it?" protested Harowandulus. "It was his only chance against us." "Sisera doesn't think so," I replied, remembering the black loot on the face of the captain of the hosts, and a deep foreboding settled over me. I was sleeping a troubled sleep that night when a hand on my shoulder shook me awake. I forced open my eyes and looked into a shadowed face that was bending over me. It was Hannibal. I sat up with a violent start, my hand reaching for my knife. For so many things had happened to me that this was always my first thought, but Hannibal was not about to kill me. He sat back and watched me while I calmed myself, asking him angrily what he was trying to do to give me such a fright. "I swore I would never speak to you again," he said at last, "or even say your name, but now I must, because I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked wonderingly, which was a foolish question, we being on the eve of battle. But somehow I did not think this was what Hannibal feared. "I have always been afraid," said Hannibal. I frowned in disbelief. Hannibal the smiling, Hannibal the lordly, Hanabaal, the master of such wealth and so many slaves? I felt as I had felt when Memnet said that it was Sisera who feared all the others. Always afraid, said Hanabaal. Afraid of the Egyptian garrisons, that they might take me away as a hostage, or take my father away if he could not raise enough tribute. Afraid of the Hittites, that they might come down and burn and pillage again. Afraid of the priests, that they might give me to the god if an unblemished firstborn child of rank could not be found. Afraid of the gods, but most of all, afraid of Moloch, always of Moloch. He wiped his forehead with a fine linen cloth, and I found that I was feeling a little sick. But, I asked him after a while, what is it you are afraid of now? What is this sin they say you are atoning for? Not my sin, said Hanabaal, yours, and that other one who calls himself my kinsman. 7 other children were sacrificed in Yabin's place to appease the god. The people spit on us in the streets, on us, on the house of Ethbaal. My father lies in his bed, and I think he is dying, and I must leave my home unprotected and offer myself in battle as an atonement for my family's crime against Moloch. Now, when... He stopped and beat his clenched fist helplessly against his knee. Now when what? I prompted him impatiently. The sea people have begun their attack on Egypt. Our sailors have seen their fleet sailing south from Crete and eastward towards Sidon. The Egyptians make ready to withdraw their garrisons from Tyre and the other cities to swell their troops at home, and my sister is there alone, my sister and my grandmother, with no one to defend them but a dying man and Achil the Philistine. I finished for him, staring into the shadows in dismay. The night seemed to hang heavy like a blanket in the tent, and I had begun to tremble. After a moment, Hanabaal said, you must make me a promise. There is no one else. We're having some allergies today. Sorry about that. It's okay. There is no one else. That is why I have broken my vow and spoken to you. What must I do? I asked him. I will die in this battle, said Hanabaal. I caught my breath and made the sign against evil. My family has offended Moloch, and I know now that only my death will appease him. You must promise me that, if you live, you will go back to Tyre and keep Methittabel safe. There is no one else. You must promise. I promised, for I had brought so much trouble upon him that I could refuse him nothing. And for a long time after I lay turning his words over in my mind, while he, his mind at rest, slept peacefully beside me. But I was to have no sleep that night. Not long after, Haruwandulus shook me by the shoulder. Are you awake? He whispered. I am now, I grumbled. I have been awake a long time, he said solemnly, thinking, Uriah Tarhond. Was there an old woman in your village? Of course, I snapped, and tried to bury my head beneath my robe, but Haruwandulus clung to my shoulder. Do you remember any of the things she used to do? Our old woman put a curse on a man they thought was helping Midas the Phrygian, and he sickened and died. I sat up angrily. What are you talking about? What I have been thinking, said Haruwandulus, is that if it would work for her, why would it not work for us? I stared at him, the skin beginning to crawl on the back of my neck. These things are very strange, said Haruwandulus. All this rain when the season is past, and that Egyptian is good as asking the gods to turn against us. Your Hanabaal was right. The Canaanites are not good for much, but they know about things like that. Look. I looked at what he held in his hand and saw that somewhere he had gotten hold of a bit of wax and a piece of mutton fat. I began to tremble, for these things in the hands of priests and old women were very powerful. You are going to make a curse, I whispered. Why not? Come on. Feeling as if I were in a dream, I followed him to where the coals of fire were glowing balefully. Haruwandulus looked with some fear at what he held in his hand. Wait, I said. It's blasphemy. Only the old women and the priests are allowed to make curses. But there is no old woman here, said Harowandulus, and Hannibal was right when he said nothing would be worse blasphemy than that song Moses sang. Maybe this will help. At least we can try. Solemnly he held his hands out over the fire. May our offering please you, goddess, O my lady of the lions, mother of the land of Hatti, queen of heaven and earth. Suddenly he cast what he held in his hands upon the coals, and I started at the hissing, sizzling sound. As this wax has flattened, as this mutton fat has perished, so shall he who works evil against the gods of Hatti be flattened like wax and perish like mutton fat. So shall the tribes of Israel and their God be flattened like wax and perish like mutton fat. The face of Harowandulus looked red and strange in the light from the coals. The smell of the melting wax and sputtering fat made me sick. I could feel cold sweat on my forehead and on the palms of my hand. When the flame had died down, Harowandulus sighed. Now they are accursed, he said. I would have cursed Moses too, but we need every man in battle. He was smiling with relief and satisfaction, and already looked half asleep again. He settled himself on the ground, wrapped himself in his robe, and seemed ready to slumber till noon. Suddenly, the feeling that had come upon me when I had said no to the priests of Moloch swept over me again. This time it came in the form of great anger. "Harowandulus, you fool!" I cried. He sat up and looked at me in hurt surprise, and then I uttered a terrible blasphemy. "Wax and mutton fat!" I cried. "What kind of gods would have anything to do with that? What kind of gods would devour children and make war against each other? What kind of gods would keep men in fear from the day when they were born? Shall I tell you what I believe? I don't believe there are any gods." I felt a great despair, but for the first time in my life, no fear of the wrath of the terrible ones. Outside, I heard the sound of the rain, which had begun again in spite of Harowandulus' curse. Chapter 20. The River Kishon. In the morning, the rain had stopped. We went out onto the field where a high place and an altar stone had been raised. The priest from Megiddo, who had come with the army, was making sacrifice. An ox was being slain, which raised our spirits, for the sacrificial meat would make fine flour for the captains, but we never ate it. The horn of the lookout warned us first. "They're coming out," someone shouted, and then the sacrifice and the sacrificial meat were forgotten, though the priest and his attendants went calmly on with their work and their chanting, while horns sounded all around, and captains of 1,000 and captains of 100 shouted their commands. The tribes were coming out from Tabor. We could see them take form in the distance, a black horde moving over the ground in a swarm of uneven ranks. We could hear them sing a blood-chilling chant from thousands of mouths. I could not hear the words, but knew what they must be. "The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name." Each of us knew this place. The horses were brought, and charioteers worked swiftly to harness them, while the rest of us armed ourselves and fastened down our helmets. "I wish there were a mirror," cried Moses, "so I could see how I must look. Ah, Sinuhe the stranger, like you I will strike terror into the hearts of the foreigners." My spear was in my hand, and at my side the curved sword and battle hatchet, shaped in the holy sign of the double axe. Hannibal and I mounted into our chariot behind Labarnish and the other 2 horses. Our squadron and the others formed into battle order beyond the trenches without commands from Sisera, so well were we trained. Sisera drove his chariot back and forth along the lines, gulping down the remains of his breakfast and swallows of water to wet his throat, giving his orders to the captains of the squadrons, shouting so that as many as possible could hear his words. "Let them come out well across the plains, too far to run back to their hills. Their numbers are greater than ours, as you can see, and they are counting on that. They have not even built barricades, but they are shepherds and the children of desert rats, and they will scatter before us like chaff before the wind. The scythes of our chariots will cut them down like wheat in the fields, and you foot soldiers will not even have to finish them off. They cannot retreat, for you can see that our chariots north of Tabor have already begun to roll. Remember your training. Remember the Baals. Wait for the signal. He rode back, and a roar of cheering rose up from all our throats, then died down, and all was quiet within the ranks. All of us strained forward, awaiting the signal. "It is time," Hannibal whispered to me. "It must be time." But still Sisera waited, and now the chanting of thousands of Hebrews was ringing in our ears. As they came closer, they seemed to fill the plain, a great mass suddenly taking shape and color, so that we could see their rags and their nakedness, their black beards and their terrible anger that drove them forward. For a moment I felt a great fear. Then, at a signal, the standards of the cities of Canaan were raised. The standard of Harosheth was the standard of the Hittites, and my fear was driven out. The final signal came. The captain of the hosts lifted his spear and brought it down again. The horns sounded for the light chariots to ride out, and the air rang with their yells. They rolled across the plain into the ranks of the Hebrews, cutting down all they met. But the Hebrews, though they were halted, did not scatter. Some of the drivers were pulled to the ground, and some horses slain, but many more of the Hebrews fell. The cries were terrible to hear. "You see," I said to Hannibal, "that was old women's talk last night. You are not going to die today. It is they who are going to die." A second squadron of light chariots was dispatched. "Keep clear of the ruts," shouted the captain. "Keep up your speed." By now, all the ground between us and the enemy was being trampled and rolled into a mass of ridges and pools. The shock of the second light cars had gained us a little ground, and there seemed to be some wavering in the ranks of the Hebrews. We knew it was time for the heavy chariots to make out and crush them entirely. The horns sounded for the leveling of our spears. "Squadron, hurrah!" shouted our captain of the 100. "For Astarte and the Baals!" I felt the lurching of our chariot as it started forward, and in the same moment I knew that something was wrong. We did not roll out across the field, gaining speed as we rushed toward the enemy. Instead, we jerked and sank, started and stopped, went a little distance, and finally came to a dead stop, our wheels mired down in the mud. "What's wrong?" I shouted. "Start them up again." I looked around and saw that all across the field the heavy chariots were sinking into the ruts. Horses were straining, some struggling through, most brought to a halt as we had been. The rain had done its work. The chanting of the Israelites had ceased, but now, among those who had not been slain by the light chariots, a terrible shouting and shrieking arose. 10,000 spear points were leveled at our breasts, and they came toward us at a dead run, swelling in size till they blotted out the sun. "The whip! The whip!" shouted Hannibal. "No!" I cried. For the charioteer was beating Labarnish, and I could see that even his strength would not loosen the wheels from the mud. "Unharness him!" I cried. "He is useless to us now, and they will kill him. Let him go!" The charioteer did not obey me, and only beat the 3 horses more. In great anger, I jumped from the chariot and dragged him to the ground. I would have killed him, but all my thoughts were for Labarnish. I unharnessed him and struck him to drive him back, away from the spears of the enemy. He reared up above me, whinnying in fear. "Go, Labarnish," I cried. "They will kill you with their spears." But Labarnish would not go. He was afraid and puzzled and would not leave me. The men of our host, too, were puzzled and afraid. Our unconquerable chariots were of no use to us now. Some dismounted to face the oncoming tribesmen on foot. Others stayed in their places while their drivers vainly tried to whip their horses forward. But a few of them, Hittites or Egyptians, released their horses and mounted them, messenger style, and together with infantry and dismounted chariot men went forward through the mud to meet the Hebrews and break the shock of the attack. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I lost my place. When I saw this, and seeing that Labarnish would not be saved, I sprang onto his back, as I had so often done at home, and rode him forward into the ranks of the enemy. "Go, Labarnish, go!" I shouted, and Labarnish obeyed me now, for he had been trained to attack. "Harosheth and great Hati!" I shrieked. "Hi ye something. Teshub and the double axe." Haroandulus and Ahmoses were among those who rode, each taking a horse from between the shafts of their chariot.
I'm sorry.
We went swiftly, for these were good horses, and without the chariots could cover wet ground as well as dry. We rode straight against them, foot soldiers following, coming into that milling mass of men with a shock that almost knocked us from our mounts. Though the wheels and scythes were halted that would have torn and scattered the Hebrews, still for a while all went well. The tribesmen fought with clumsy spears and clubs and stones and ancient swords, while our arms and armor were the finest in the world. The warriors shied away from Labarnish and his trampling hoofs. I saw Haroandulus clearing a circle around him with his axe, while Ahmoses was silent and skillful with his curved sword. Many times I caught sight of Hannibal sitting in his mired chariot raised above the field and fighting with the strength of 7 Baals. Fear and hatred had transformed him. The glow of battle was on his face as I had never thought to see it, and he was as beautiful as Adonai, as he killed many men who tried to drag him down. Sisera, too, stood high in his chariot, a guard of men close about him. His bright helmet shone, and his plumes waved as he tried, with shouts and signals, to bring some order into what was happening. But order now was all on the side of the Hebrews, for with our chariots gone, our training had failed us, and each man now did as he pleased. The Hebrews, though, stood close, captainless and ill-armed as they were. They had been well taught. Many of them had knowingly sacrificed their lives to stop the first shock of the light chariots, had, in fact, been trained and put in the front ranks for that purpose. Now they fought grimly and without disorder, heeding and following the signals of the ram's horn, and little by little we were beginning to give ground. I saw them kill Haroandulus. Still singing, he had ridden into a knot of the tribesmen and cut down some of them before a man seized him from behind and began to drag him from his horse. "Haroandulus," I shouted, "behind you! Cut him down! I'm coming!" I rode toward him, trampling all in my way, but it was too late. They cut him down with spears and swords, and while I watched, someone seized the mane of Labarnish and grasped me around the waist, dragging me to the ground. But the hoofs of Ahmoses' horse trampled him. "Thanks," I gasped, and saw him laugh and raise his hand. Now the tribesmen were thick among us, fighting like wild men. I had lost sight of Labarnish, though I thought I could hear his wild whinnying. I swung about me with my battle-axe, trying to cut my way toward the sound. I found him at last, and I saw him die, a fierce young fellow with a face like Samuel's, and all his hatred for the oppressors and their horses in his eyes, and I seized his mane and cut his throat. Had seized. There's no I in that. The guy that looked like Samuel. Yeah, okay. I went blind then, and heard nothing but my own screaming, and knew nothing but that I had killed the young man, and was trying to kill him again and again. Then I made my way to Labarnish. I saw his eyes darken, and his knees give way, while the blood gushed from his throat, and saw him sink to the ground in a great golden broken heap. I fell across his body, and perhaps they thought I was dead, for no one touched me. While I lay there, I heard a voice shouting above the battle, a voice I remembered well, the voice of a shepherd, the voice of Barak. When my head cleared, I rose to my feet and looked about me. Hannibal no longer stood high above the field, but was lost to sight, and I knew that his words of the night before had come true. And then I saw that we of Canaan were no longer fighting for a glorious victory, but were fighting for our very lives. They drove us back toward Megiddo, though some of us were already fleeing north toward Harosheth. All chariots had been abandoned, and even Sisera could no longer be seen. We no longer fought in squadrons and ranks, but every man for himself, and more among us began to break and run. Through the day they drove us back and pursued and killed us, and finally we gave up even the show of doing battle, but fled before them to our shame, and at last we came to the river Kishon. This Kishon was not wide across, but that day it had swollen with the rains, and in some places had overflowed its banks so that the ground was treacherous. The waters were yellow with mud torn from the banks, and leapt and churned as they pushed their way toward the sea. I stood on the edge and could not take my eyes from those yellow waters. I hardly heard the cries and moans of our broken and fleeing hosts, filling the air around me. All I could hear was the rushing of the river. "We have to cross," said a voice above me. I looked up and saw that it was Moses, still mounted and staring at the river with as grim a look as mine. "I can't swim," I cried, shaken with a cold chill. "Then learn," said Moses. "If you stay here, they will cut you to pieces." "Then they will cut me to pieces. Better that than to be carried off by the water." All around us, men were wavering on the banks. Some began to enter the water. I watched one of them sinking deep into the treacherous mud. He struggled on, however, till he lost his footing in the middle of the river, and was swept away with pitiful cries that were finally choked off by the waters. "I can't do it," I said again, for such a horror of the water had come over me that I was almost mad with fear. Other men, too, had tried and met the same fate, and now some of them, in panic, had determined to stay and face the enemy on the water's edge, though they knew there were only two choices: to die on the swords of the tribesmen, or to try to escape on the other side. "Come," said Moses, "my horse will carry me. Hang on to his tail. He will get us across." "No," I answered, shivering helplessly. "Then climb on behind me," said Moses. "Maybe he can carry us both." "I will not be the cause of your death," I said. "Your horse can carry you to the other side. With me he will stumble, and you will surely drown." The mouth of Moses became thin, and his jaw looked more stubborn than ever. "If you stay, I will stay," he said, "and then you will surely be the cause of my death." I knew he meant it. But I lost my place. I knew he meant it, so I mounted behind him, clinging tight around his waist and pressing my knees into the side of his horse. My eyes were tight shut, for I could not look upon the river. I could feel the water surging up around us as the horse's legs sank deep into the muddy bottom, but he struggled bravely, and we were moving forward. Then I felt him stumble and almost lose his footing. "Your axe!" I heard Moses cry. "Get rid of your axe and your sword and your helmet!" I obeyed him. The horse regained his footing, but only for a little while. Then he sank into the mud again and stumbled in earnest, throwing me sideways from his back. Without thinking, and to my shame, I clutched for Moses to save myself. This unsteadied him, and he too slid from his mount and into the churning water. I screamed when I felt the river closing over me, and then felt my scream choked off, but Moses got hold of me around the neck. He was a strong swimmer, and sometimes he got my head above the water so that I could breathe. The river carried us far, but finally we both found our footing even in the mud. Helped by some oleander bushes that overhung the opposite bank, we dragged ourselves ashore. For a long time I lay gasping on the bank of the river, Moses stretched out beside me. Anyone who had passed us might have thought that we were dead, but there were not many to pass. Those who did not try to cross the river were slain by the enemy, and many of those who did were swept away by the water. And those who say that all the army of Sisera was destroyed are very nearly right. Through the night we lay on the river bank. All was quiet, and the sun was rising when I finally brought myself to move. I was not wounded, except for a few cuts and bruises, but I ached all over from the flight and the battering in the river, and from the weariness and hunger. Turning my head, I watched Moses bow himself before the glow from the rising sun in the manner of the Egyptians. "Where are they?" I asked him, for all was so quiet. I struggled painfully to my knees. "Don't stand yet," Moses warned. "You nearly drowned, and there is still much water in you." He crouched beside me. "They are dead, as far as I know, and the tribesmen are following those who escaped on toward Harosheth." I sat back, trying to understand it. "Dead?" I said. "All of them? Hannibal, Harowendulis? I saw Harowendulis die." I shuddered. "I know, I saw it too," said Moses. "But back there," he waved his hand toward the river, "one passed me who said he had seen that Sisera escaped north." For a moment I was glad. Then I felt sick with shame, as I thought of Sisera coming down from his proud chariot and fleeing on his feet before the enemy. I lay back, staring at Moses. "The world has gone all wrong," I cried stubbornly. "You are an Egyptian, and I am a Hittite, and yet you have fought beside me and saved my life, and we are beaten. How can it be?" "Are you hungry?" asked Moses. He was not wondering at all this. He was like a man whom nothing could surprise, to whom everything had already happened. "I know I have seen you before," I said. "Where was it?" Moses shrugged. We had better see about getting some food, but water first." We drank our fill from the river. It was not so rough as it had been before, but was muddy still and bitter. "Have you a water skin with you?" said Moses. "You had better fill it. To follow the course of the river will lead us toward Harosheth, and the Hebrews will be there. We must head west toward the sea." "What town is nearest?" I asked him. "Megiddo, where my garrison was," said Moses. "But the Hebrews will be there too. The nearest seaport is Dor. We had better go there. It should not be a day's walk. And then, at least there will be someone there who will give us food." We rose to our feet, and I gazed back across the river upon the field of the dead. "Labarnish is back there," I cried suddenly. "Are you coming?" said Moses. "Harowendulis should have a Hittite funeral," I said. "For 13 days we should mourn him with feasting. The fire that burns him should be quenched with 10 jugs of beer and 10 jugs of wine, and his bones laid in oil on a silver jar, wrapped in linen and a fine garment." "Come," said Moses. "How long can we live without food?" But as we set out, I wept for Labarnish, that he was dead, and I must leave him alone. That is the end of chapter 20. I hope that you're enjoying the reading today. We'll begin next time with chapter 21, A Promise to be Kept. Chapter 21, A Promise to be Kept, and the first word is we. So, once again, I hope you're enjoying the story, and we'll